everyone, and welcome to this NEA Big Read Waukesha Reads presentation on preserving your family's history with oral history stories. If you have questions during the program tonight, go ahead and type them into the YouTube chat box. We will be compiling them to be answered at the end of the presentation. And our presenter tonight is one of Waukesha Public Library's adult reference librarians who has a special interest in oral history. Everybody please welcome Erin Dix.
All right, hello. Thank you, Corey. And welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this program. I'm happy to be here to talk with you about preserving your family stories with oral history. I want to share just a little bit of my background before we get into the presentation. So I have my master's degree from UW-Madison, from the library school there. And while I was there, I worked for about a year with the oral history program at the UW Archives, which is a really great resource for really the whole state. And after that time, I was an archivist at Lawrence University up in Appleton for 9 years. And so in both of those roles, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of recorded interviews as part of oral history collections and to conduct interviews myself. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in terms of my experience. But for full disclosure, I have not recorded interviews with my own family members. Putting this presentation together reminded me that I really should think about doing that. So I hope that some of you are inspired similarly. There are a lot of excellent resources out there for learning more about doing family oral history. And so this presentation, to put this together, I compiled a lot of information from those resources. And there's a couple places, I'm going to pull up a slideshow in a second here that we'll go through. And you'll notice a couple of slides where I've pulled together some specific resources. So I would really encourage you to check those out, to do some of your own research if you're interested in learning more beyond what we talk about this evening. Okay, so now I'm going to try to share my screen and we'll see if we can get this going. Okay, are we good with this? Okay, awesome. So I'm going to start this. Okay. So this is a quick outline of what we're gonna talk about. So we'll talk about what oral history is, how to prepare for an interview, how to conduct the interview, how to share and preserve that recording, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts, and I can try and address any questions that you might have typed into that chat box. Just sort of for your planning, this presentation takes about 30 to 40 minutes, so not too long. And really the overall goal here is to provide you with the information that you would need to plan and record an oral history interview with a family member or friend. I'm assuming we have an audience of mostly adults, but you can absolutely involve kids in these experiences, and that can be really powerful and fun for everyone. And I would say you could even use some of the information about doing an interview just for having conversations with your family about your history without that pressure of recording. So I think there are a number of things that you could take away from this, I hope. Okay, so what is oral history? What are we talking about? Oh, one of these didn't work. That's okay. The term oral history is used pretty loosely these days. So these are some examples of things. Hopefully you can see we've got an oral history of Center Stage, which is a truly excellent dance movie from the year 2000. I think the image down on the bottom left was an oral history of David Pumpkins. I'm sad that you can't see that. David Pumpkins is in Saturday Night Live sketch. Anyway, then on the right, we have World War Z, an oral history of the zombie war. I have read and loved all of these things, but I would say they wouldn't quite meet the definition of oral history that a historian would use. So this is the definition of oral history that comes from the Oral History Association. It's a field of study and a method for gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. So when historians talk about oral history, they are talking about recorded interviews with people that collect and preserve their memories and personal commentaries. There are professional oral historians. It is a formal discipline, as Oral History Association would imply. Broadly speaking, the oral tradition as a way of sharing stories and preserving information predates the written word. But more narrowly, oral history, at least in the United States, it really started gaining popularity in the mid 20th century, when there was sort of you had at the same time technological advances that meant that it was easy to go out into the field to record interviews with people. And there was this shift in the historical sort of academic discipline from a traditional history that really focused on the stories of great men, right? Presidents, leaders, celebrities, elites, upper classes. In the 1960s, that focus shifted away to a focus on social history, or the history of ordinary people. And oral history really provides a way to fill the gaps in written history, to preserve the stories of people that you might not find in paper records. Many of the professionals who do oral history are associated with libraries or archives or museums or other institutions that have collections of oral history interviews. And many of those collections are accessible to the public for their own research use, and even a lot of those are available online. So I have several examples that I want to share. The first is an organization called Densho, and there's a description of it there on the right. Densho is devoted to preserving the stories of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. So very relevant to our big reads this year. And they have just this fantastic online repository of all of these oral history interviews. And I have a quick excerpt from one that I want to share. This was an interview with Sue Kunitomi, who was incarcerated at Manzanar, and she talks here briefly about leaving Manzanar. So I'm going to try and play this for you all.
Tell me the circumstances of your leaving camp.
I decided after the December 7th riot that I did not want to spend another Christmas in Manzanar. And so I filed an application for what they call application for leave, which was the original title of the loyalty oath. And I got an offer from the YWCA in Madison, Wisconsin for a month of board and room, and they would help me find a job. I had several friends who had gone to work at the Madison General Hospital and a Catholic hospital. They were nurses, and they were writing to me to tell me to come out, and things are very much better back east. And so when the offer came from the YWCA, I decided to take it and go and try to get into the University of Wisconsin, because I wanted to go back to school. And so that's how I got to leave camp.
Okay, so that's a great example of a pretty brief excerpt from a video oral history interview that, again, is from Densho. More locally, there are some really great oral history collections available at the Wisconsin Historical Society. The one on the left there describes the Somos Latinas project, which was a collection of oral history interviews that interviewed Latina activists in Wisconsin a few years ago. So those are available online. And then on the right, there's an example of a project from UW-Milwaukee about, they had an HIV/AIDS oral history project. So these are things that you could check out. UW-Milwaukee, I think, also has some really great civil rights focused collections of oral histories. So really there's just a lot out there to see. And I have one more example before we get into the sort of how-to portion here. This is an interview from my previous job. When I was at Lawrence University, we had a lot of interviews with alumni. And this is an example, just a really quick excerpt that I used to play for college students when I was telling them about oral history and describing how it can tell stories that you wouldn't find in written records. So we'll see if I can get this to play for you.
And we used to walk, they're talking now about the river walk.
Right.
There used to be a little path that you walked. They called it going down river.
Oh, over
And-
to the
Yeah,
Alexander.
and there was a cemetery down,
Oh, okay.
and it's where we all went to do a little smooching. You know,
At the cemetery.
in the cemetery. Well, it was kind of quiet. You could sit at the foot of and that was when, if you said we're going down river, everybody knew what you meant, where you were headed. and except that there was a screech owl down there that got very eerie, spooky sounds if you were sitting late at night in the cemetery.
Yeah.
Okay. I just really love that. I love that excerpt. So that's probably plenty of examples for you all. So now I think we can move into how to do this yourself. So preparing for the interview. As with so many things, the planning, this is where most of the work is. So there's a lot to talk about here. When you're getting started, you want to start by figuring out what is your goal? What are you hoping to do? And you'll talk it over with the person that you're hoping to interview. Do you want to record a general life history, or do you want to focus on their experiences in a particular time? Are you hoping mainly to record famous family lore, or are you aiming to get a full and honest picture of their lives and relationships? You want to be clear about what you're going to do with the interview once it's finished as well. Which family members will you share it with, and in what format, things like that. You want to think through all of that. And if you're planning to publish the interview in any form, including posting it on the internet, you will need some sort of signed documentation of permission from the person being interviewed, because these are their stories and they belong to them, and they should be able to control what happens with them. So those are things to think about. And once you have some of that sorted out, before you do the interview, it's a good idea to do a little bit of research. If you have any relevant family history documents, those would be good to look over, family photos or home movies, things like that. And if you're going to be asking your interviewee about their experience with a larger event, like, for example, the civil rights movement, you might want to do some reading to make sure you understand that context as well, so you can write some informed questions and be able to discuss that with them. Then you'll prepare an outline of topics to go over. And again, share that with the person that you're going to interview. You can write up a list of questions, and certainly that's what I used to do when I would do interviews. The sort of danger with that is that if you've written a list of questions and you give it to the person, sometimes you might get sort of sticking too closely to that, almost like it's a script. Whereas if you've got some topics generally that you want to cover, that can leave the sort of flow of conversation a little bit more open. The person who's being interviewed can that gives them the space to share things that might not be on like a set list of questions. So that's sort of a personal preference, but something to think about there. And again, just you're talking all of this over with the person that you're interviewing. You don't want to just like walk up to grandma and stick a microphone in her face, right? You want to make sure that she knows and understands and is totally on board with the project. Okay, how are you going to record? There's a lot to talk about here, and we are going to get into the weeds a little bit. But big picture, first you want to figure out, do you want to do an audio recording or a video recording? And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. With video, as we saw with Sue Kunitomi's interview, obviously that adds a lot to the record. You have that added benefit of actually seeing them speaking. On the other hand, digital video can be much harder to preserve in the long term than audio because there's so much more information and complexity that makes up that file. The other thing to think about is that sometimes people can feel a little bit more shy when they have a video camera pointed at them. Whereas with an audio recorder, it could feel a little bit less obtrusive and they might be a little bit more comfortable. So for those reasons, I have always preferred doing audio interviews, but you can absolutely do video, and I will share some options for that. Then there's the question of whether you're going to do an in-person versus a remote interview. And this is obviously complicated by our current reality. I'm going to walk through options for both, starting with options for recording in person, but I do recommend thinking very carefully about whether you feel it's safe to conduct an in-person interview with someone outside of your household, especially someone who might be older during this pandemic. I guess personally, I would not recommend doing that. So I would really say that the following might be best considered as guidance for post-pandemic times, which will eventually come. We will eventually be there. Okay, so for in-person interviews, if you're going to do an audio interview, and particularly if you're planning to do like a bunch of interviews, to interview a number of family members, and if you really want high quality audio that will last for a long time, if you're doing a big project like that, you might think about investing in a digital audio recorder. Certainly this is the kind of equipment that a library or a historical society or any sort of place like that, if they're doing an oral history project, they're probably using a digital audio recorder. Good ones can be a couple $100s, so it's not a small investment. But that is an option that's open to you. Alternately, if you're not interested in that, if you have a smartphone, there are a lot of different apps that you can use, and that's really very easy. If you have an iPhone, iPhones come with a voice memo app, so it's already on your phone. If you have an Android phone like I do, you can just search the App Store for any sort of voice recorder. Easy Voice Recorder is one example. I downloaded it to my phone. It's just super easy and works really well. So those are options. You could also maybe record directly to a laptop, especially if you have an external microphone. So lots of options there. For video, smartphones or digital cameras can work pretty well. If you're going to use a phone, you might want like a little tripod or stand to sit it on so that you're not like holding your phone for an hour. That probably would not be fun. And just like with audio, if you have a decent laptop, you can probably record video directly to it. And again, another thing to consider would be an external microphone just for better audio quality. not required, but something like a little clip-on mic that you can just have on someone's shirt can cost as little as $12, and it can really boost the quality of the audio. So those are things to think about for in-person interviews. If you want to record an interview during the pandemic, or if you're really at a distance from someone and it's hard to visit, you can definitely consider doing a remote interview. For audio for a remote interview, again, if you've got a smartphone, there are apps you can download. You'd be looking for a call recorder app. So there are a couple of examples there on the slide. Tape a Call was one that a lot of professionals recommended. It is not free, but I'm sure that there are free call recorder apps for iPhones. And there's one for Android. Cube Call Recorder is just one example. But you can do your own research and see if you want to do that. For recording a remote video interview, you could use good old Zoom, everybody's favorite. If you have a free account with Zoom, that allows you to have calls that are up to 40 minutes, and you can record those as MP4 video files. There's also FaceTime if you have a Mac, or Skype. Those are tools that you could use as well. No matter what tools or software you end up using, you want to make sure that you know where the microphones are and test everything beforehand. If you're going to be recording to your phone or a laptop, you also want to make sure that there is sufficient storage for the file so that it won't run out of space while you're recording. Okay. So if at this point you're like, oh my gosh, that was so much, my head is spinning, what do I do? I get it. So this is what I would recommend if you're in that camp. If you're not interested in the technological details, first of all, I would say if at all possible, wait until you feel it's safe to do an in-person recording. I think that's easier and will result in a better quality experience. And I would say do an audio recording. If you have a smartphone, use one of those audio recorder apps, like the voice memo for the iPhone or another voice recorder for your smartphone. If you do not have a smartphone, you might want to think about just getting a cheap voice recorder. I know I mentioned the more expensive digital audio recorders, but you can also just get like a really cheap voice recorder from like Amazon or Target for something in the $30 range, and that will absolutely work. So that's what I'd recommend. But really, you just need to, think about your options and choose whatever seems easiest or best from your perspective. And here I have a list of some other resources. If you want to learn more about tools and equipment for recording oral histories, a couple of those are from the Vermont Folklife Center for recording interviews remotely or in person. Got one from UW-Milwaukee that's really great. And that last link there is for a site called Oral History in the Digital Age. That's sort of geared towards professionals, but there's a ton of useful information there. So if you really want to get into it, I would definitely recommend checking that one out. Okay, so next step, actually doing the interview. So you want to set a time and location, whether you're meeting in person or virtually. Try to record in a place that doesn't have too much background noise. In terms of timing, depending on your goals, you might allow 90 minutes or so. I would say that 2 hours is usually the maximum before energy really starts to flag for everyone. And especially if you're recording somebody's life history and they're really, really getting into it, it's much better to record an interview in multiple sessions rather than trying to have one marathon session. Anytime you're doing a recording like this, it's a good idea to start by saying your names, the date and location. So my name is Erin Dix. I'm here with Betty Cooper. It's October 14th, 2020. We're recording an oral history interview in her home, something like that. Future historians will thank you if you do that. Always a good thing. Okay, so the interviewee, the person who's being interviewed, is the star of the show. Your role is to ask questions and you're helping to guide that interview, but you really want to try not to speak too much yourself or to interrupt. You will be actively listening, which is really hard work, but it's worth it. So you'll ask open-ended questions to start and then listen to what they have to say, and you can sort of ask clarifying follow-up questions as needed. But make sure that you allow some time to sit with pauses that might come up rather than jumping to fill those. It's really important that the person being interviewed has the space to sort of reflect as memories are sort of being stirred up. So that's important to remember. You might want to have some things like family photos or other documents available, just because those can also help to stir memories as someone is thinking back. And then lastly, just remember that the process can be emotional, and that can be emotional for everyone. And don't shy away. I would recommend not shying away from topics that might be emotional or sensitive. Just be aware that those feelings can come up, and it's okay. Just be sensitive to that. Okay, these are some example questions that I took from lots of different sources, and I won't read all of these to you. But notice that these are all open-ended questions. They're not leading questions. So you're not saying, for example, did you find it really hard to balance work and family? You're saying, how did you balance work and family? And again, if you start with some sort of open questions like these, then you can follow up if you need particular details clarified or things like that. So the internet has lots and lots of resources for generating questions. And these are a few sources that I found that I really liked. But yeah, you can use Google to help you with this. There are many, many good lists of questions out there. Okay, moving on to sharing and preserving the recording. So hooray, you finished the interview. That's good. You might want to edit the interview if you have the inclination. There are some really good editing tools that are free. So if you've got an audio interview, something like Audacity is a software that's free for any platform, pretty easy to use. GarageBand comes with Mac computers, so that could be an option. If you're using a smartphone app, some of those apps might be able to make basic editing changes, like if you've got your audio file and you want to clip out some sort of dead time at the beginning or the end and crop that out, you can do that. Or if you want to boost the levels, if it's pretty quiet, those are the kinds of things that you might think about doing. And the same goes for video editors. Most computers these days come with some sort of built-in video editor for basic editing. So this is not required, but if you have the skills and the time and the inclination, you might think about just making some little changes to your files so that they're all ready to go. And then sharing. We are living in a time when it's really easy to share digital files, and that's great. Again, make sure that you have the interviewee's permission before you go ahead and share that. And then just one note, if you are thinking that you might want to donate that recording to a library or archive, they will want probably a signed release form that will clarify permission for research use. So just keep that in mind. If you're just doing this for your own family use, you don't need to worry about that. Okay, preserving. Preserving digital files is a topic that could be its own presentation, but I'll keep it quick here. The short story is that it can actually be harder to preserve digital files than it is to preserve their analog equivalent. A good rule of thumb is called the 3-2-1 rule. And that means 3 copies that are stored on 2 different media with one of those being offsite. So for example, that might mean 1 copy on your computer's hard drive, another copy on a family member's hard drive, and a 3rd copy in cloud storage like Google Drive. So not too hard. And then also every 5 years or so, you'll want to check on your files and migrate them to newer formats as needed. If this is something that is stressing you out again, if you don't really want to think about this, and if you have extra time, you might want to type out a written transcript of the interview. That can be time consuming to do, but then you have an additional backup. You can print that out and have a piece of paper or, sheets of paper that you can put in a folder, and it's not subject to the same sorts of concerns about obsolescence. So it's sort of an extra layer of security if you want to do that. Okay, so just a couple of final thoughts here before we get to some time for questions, if there are any. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Good advice always. What I've shared here are some good rules of thumb and best practices, but if you are feeling sort of intimidated by this or any of this, you should not let it stop you from giving it a try. Again, as far as the equipment goes, use whatever tools seem easiest and most natural for you. Just sitting down with your loved one and a recording device for an hour, or calling them up with FaceTime or Skype, or again, even just having a conversation with no recording, any of those things will certainly be worth it, and you'll be glad that you did it. And then lastly, this is a quote from a fairly recent story in Atlas Obscura about oral history for families by Jessica Hester. I just really liked this. So she said, an oral history isn't about extracting a story. It's about strengthening bonds and appreciating people who take the time to share their view of the world. I just really like how that emphasizes that oral history is about connection, which is something that we could all use more of. Okay, so that is the end of my sort of prepared remarks here. And at this point, if there are any questions that folks have raised in the chat, I would be happy to try and answer those.
Hey, Erin. Right now, no questions have come in yet, but we'll wait just a minute because there's a little bit of a delay between YouTube and Zoom. But I want to point out to everybody that if you log off and have questions later, Erin works at Waukesha Public Library, so you can always contact her here, and I'm sure she would be happy to answer your questions at a later time.
Yes, I would. Thank you.
Oh.
Very true. And this presentation or this recording will be in YouTube right, Corey and Sarah?
Yep.
So if you could come back to this later. I know I shared a lot of different links to things, so this will be something you can come back to later if you feel so inclined.
Yes, this will live on youtube.com/Waukesha Reads. So you can go back there and look up anything that you want to see again. Anything come in? Okay, I guess we don't have any questions because Erin did such a complete presentation. Thank you, Erin, for doing that presentation for us. It was great. And thanks for being part of Waukesha Reads.
Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you both, Sarah and Corey.
Of course. All right. Good night, everybody.